In the grim darkness of the 21st century, there's only the explanation for social action. And welcome to Varn Blog. Today I'm with PH. PH is master's degree haver. Back in the States, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm back in my home state, good old Idaho.
You're my state neighbor.
Yeah.
You're in the actually even more reactionary state. PH is a former person of the Former People editorial collective, and the host of Radical Thoughts, a brave, one may say foolhardy project to read every radical thought thinker released by Verso, which means you get to read a lot about Baudrillard.
Yeah.
So I don't. Well, depending on the Baudrillard, I don't envy you, but actually the Verso ones tend not to be great.
Yeah, they're not his most interesting stuff. We did just have Amo Sahu on, though, which was a really good discussion.
Oh, yeah.
So all the networks intersect.
Friend of the show, person whose life I ruined, Amo Sahu. And I'm going to have him on to talk about Kim Moody sometime, I think in the new year. It's hard to schedule, though, with him finishing his dissertation and something he no longer believes in. But today we're talking about John Levy Martin's The Explanation of Social Action, a book that until you started quoting it, I knew very little about.
It's... sorry, I don't know what you were going to...
No, I was going to ask you, so what's the context of this book on bringing more substantive understanding of sociology? I think that's the way we might explain it.
Yeah, so I think what's interesting about this book is it's maybe the most interesting kind of quote unquote standard social science book I've read in quite some time. Particularly most interesting from a contemporary author. This was published in 2011 or something. And I first found John Levy Martin because he has a series of books that are more kind of built around this sort of grad student's guide to doing X. So he has one that's thinking through theory that's kind of about what does it mean to think rigorously about sociological theory. And he has one on methods. He has one on statistics. So this book is kind of the precursor to that, and it sort of boils his approach down into one tome, and it's basically a meta theory. It's a meta theory book because you shouldn't be confused by the title. He's not saying this is the best explanation for social action. It's more about what is the explanation of social action? What does it mean to explain social action? How do we try and think through what we should expect to say is a good or bad or rigorous kind of explanation? And I think what's interesting about it is that he proposes that a lot of social theory, a lot of sociology, a lot of social research at the moment is very prone to this kind of, what does he call, Pax Wisconsin, I think is what he calls it, which is a dig at the, University of Wisconsin, where people like Eric Olin Wright were teaching. And I think he trained there too. This kind of approach of, well, there's a lot of theories, and theories are only as good as the particular thing they're intended for. Because that means they're only more or less better for certain things. So we can't say that there's anything that's a better or worse or good or bad theory. We can only say they're better suited for this or that thing. And he's trying to make an argument, no, there actually are theories that in general we should just consider not good. And in particular, he wants to take aim at the tendency to focus on the idea that we need to find external causes for why people act in the ways that they do, by which he means we need to find ways of talking about why people do certain things that has no relationship to the way that those people claim to perceive or talk, or the way that actors themselves talk about things. And it's also important to note that he says many, many times that this is not to say that we should just take people's own explanations for their behavior at face value. he cares a lot about cognitive science and what cognitive science is telling us about actors. So he's very much willing to say, like, look, we know that we often don't understand what's going on at a certain level of our like cognizing brain. We don't always understand what's going on at the affective level of the brain. So yeah, like we can say like a lot of times we don't do a good job at coming up with explanations that make sense for our own action, because the brain is usually oriented towards doing something, not figuring out why it did something after the fact. But he says like he doesn't like third person causal explanations, because he notices that this means that you just don't have to interact with what people say as actual data at all, and it usually leads to these kind of weird explanations that just don't seem to align with like how people are actually doing things in the first place. And it kind of lets you, the theorist, just whenever there's data that seems to contradict what you're saying, you can just go, oh, well, but like these people don't understand it because it's this other thing that I've identified because of my category or whatever. And so if I keep putting my category into what's going on, then I just explain it away.
I mean, that seems particularly given to coherentist theories of social functioning, right? Like the Emile Durkheim model of sociology, where because we have the function of a system defined as the entire system itself, any individual actor's self-explanation is kind of irrelevant to that. But you can, of course, move around all kinds of different data sets that are even category types to get what you want. And I think, you know, when I was reading this book, prompted off of, for example, I'm going to pick the dumbest debate that we have the most here, which is the PMC category. And I'm like, well, everyone has a different social vector in which they define that. They ignore what people say they are. And from an analytic standpoint, it doesn't hold, but it's also like you will see people move around what the definitional vector of the category of professional managerial class is. Like sometimes the same person will give you multiple answers, which tells you that they're bending category definitions to maintain a category for some kind of post hoc motivated reasoning, like to explain something else. If it's academic disciplines effect on social functioning, which I think is somewhat people use that to explain. If it's the dominance of managerial strata in formalized capital settings where capital ownership is more abstracted through stocks, some of that explains that. But you will notice people go back and forth between those things, and those are very different things. And I was thinking about in this book, well, you have this problem all the time, like where people use sociology to write off cognitive or social psychology. But conversely, you do have the problems in social psychology that like almost none of that stuff is replicatable. Like I've been sitting down to write a explainer on the uses and abuses of terror management theory. And one of the things that I keep running into is that, for example, the sunk cost observation seems to socially hold, but any research that tied it to like thoughts of death or death being a motivating factor have not been replicatable, even when they had the same people doing the study recently. So it's like, well, how do I write that? Where I'm like, well, this observation is made here in terror management theories, where I got it from, but the entire framework may be bunkum. But in sociology, a lot of these frameworks, you couldn't there's no way to do a replication test on these categories, right? Yeah. Their validity is either coherence or pragmatic explanation, which is, you mentioned Eric Olin Wright, and I think about his book Understanding Class, which I think is an interesting book, far more interesting than people who talk about PMC theory stuff. But I also found that, like, well, sometimes when you read Eric Olin Wright, it does feel like, well, we're coming up with categories so that some of these will hold, and I can mesh this framework with this framework in a simple, like, diagramming grid, where we
Right.
have like the Marxist greater class framework about the driving capital. Then we have these stratification frameworks. And in his early work, I mean, he produces really parsimonious and elegant charts, which I look at and just go, that's bullshit.
Yeah.
Like, there's no way you're going to get an elegantly matched chart on a framework of social functioning in a society, not in it have anything particularly meaningful to say beyond broad social functioning. Now, I guess the first thing, since we've kind of gone back to the basic theory of the book, I mean, is that why should radicals give a shit about sociology?
Yeah.
To put it in a very basic way.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's an interesting question because, especially this book, like Martin Reed's really interesting to me because he's one of the few people I've encountered who like he's very, very clearly influenced by Bourdieu, who like I'm very influenced by as well. So he does have this kind of approach of like trying to talk about things that we could in certain terms call like habitus and blah blah blah, like how people act. He very much talks a lot about social class in his own research, but he's also influenced by Bruno Latour, which like usually people who like Bourdieu and people who like Latour are like at butting heads with each other because,
like at war, like eternal war.
So like Martin is the most interesting person I've encountered who really cares about the whole like beyond critique thing that Latour does. I think one of the reasons he's interesting is he doesn't. There's an interview about this book where Martin says something about like he doesn't really care about actor network theory because it's one of those things that I think he kind of is like, this is the thing people pick up because it sounds sexy, but it doesn't really like help us ground what we're doing because it's just kind of like everything all at once. So he's more interested. The thing he's most interested in with Latour, I think, is more the kind of question of like, is that point of like, maybe we need to get past the idea of critique first and foremost being the idea that people have quote unquote false experiences or false consciousness. That's kind of his main thing that I think is interesting about this book. And I do think that it's an interesting perspective for like, even people who are really into the Frankfurt School, which I'm into a fair amount of Frankfurt School stuff. I think most people that take it seriously and try to like get into some kind of like politics that involves like engaging with people, I think they usually realize at a certain point that like there's a contradiction kind of between like the truth of like, yes, social environment, social action, like there's a kind of like ingrained rationality about what is like supposed to be self-evident, this kind of, you know, quote unquote, like the real abstraction or like reification or whatever like term, like there's something true about that. And John Levy Martin is very clearly influenced by that because he always talks about stuff in those terms. He talks about how like we see things as social objects, but social objects are just bundles of relations. And he actually constantly in this book refers to Marx and Engels in like German ideology, and even talks about, you know, the concept of the commodity as being like a really good example of like thinking through this. He kind of says like, we don't have to agree with like that analysis, but it's an example of someone seeing this and trying to work through it. But at the same time, it's like, can you combine that with not instinctively telling other people like, no, you just have reified consciousness and are just wrong. And I think that's actually a really valuable thing to like try and think through seriously, like that you can understand that a lot of things that are supposedly self-evident as social objects are bundles of relations. But being a bundle of relations does not mean that the appearance of it being an object is false. It just means that the reality of those relations is they will appear in a particular form. And that human experience is like part of that you can't just like combine into this like true false dichotomy. But if there's something false, it's that you can say that people explain things in a bad way. And this is one of the things that he also points out with Marx and Engels that I think is actually true and easy to forget, is that in Capital, most of the time when Marx is being polemic, he does say that like, you know, workers and people who are in the market see things in a certain way that's a mystified form or whatever. But most of the time when he's being polemic about how people see things the wrong way, he's talking about how other people that are trying to explain social action, i.e. political economists, are producing bad explanations because they want to hold onto the self-evidentness of their categories and not explaining the relationships that go into the categories. But the point isn't to say that political economists have false experiences or something. It's to say that like they see things and experience things in a real way based on the way that relationships form, but they are not producing good explanations or good ways of like investigating it. And I think that's like a useful thing to keep in mind when a lot of people that want to like become radicals get really into this idea of like, I have my category and my category explains the world by saying how this other category is fetishized. But
my category
the point,
is not somehow like,
yeah, like and I think it's interesting, like looking at like kind of Eric and Wright, it's kind of interesting that both of these are authors who are very much influenced by like the pragmatic tradition. But Martin is very explicit that he does not like forms of pragmatism that hold the idea is you find categories that are the most useful and then you just use them because they're useful. His approach to pragmatism is more the side of like explanation needs to recognize that things in the world have real qualities and that human experience and human action perceives real qualities about things, even if the explanations for what those qualities do and are is maybe not always like adequate at the level of like phenomenological experience. He likes to quote, I think I always forget if it's James or Dewey. I think it might be James who has a quote about like, we need to not think that the world is disorder and that we throw a net of categories onto it in order to like make sense of it. And this is, maybe we can go into like, because this is where he kind of starts his argument, is that most sociological thinking begins with this kind of Freudian, Durkheimian stuff. And when I was reading it, it was very clear in my head. I was like, yes, this is like very common in social science, but it's not just common in social science. It's just really common in like discourses with anyone who like, maybe if they don't even have like a quote unquote like professionalized experience of like getting into social theory or something. It's like even people that just kind of like read a certain amount of like social theory or critical theory on their own, there's this way that the discourse starts to turn that I think is very much in the vein of what Martin is trying to criticize, because he turns to Durkheim and Freud as the examples of like problematic assumptions, because Freud gives you the ability to say that the unconscious is this thing that like operates at a level akin to the conscious, which is like through language, and that you have mechanisms of like repressed experience. And he actually gives like one of the most clear accounts of like how most people who draw on Freud don't read anything about how his actual like clinical work operated, because there's a lot of times where it's just very clearly like Freud is not necessarily making stuff up, but he's producing explanations that he can literally claim two opposing things about the same client in the same case, and then publish it with anonymous names in both cases. So it looks like he has two really rigorous accounts of something, but it's actually contradictory because it's literally two opposing accounts of the same like subject. And
what I find interesting about this with Freud, and it's interesting because I felt like this was what Karl Popper got onto the Freud, but stated better and without Karl Popper's agenda. That Freud has, like Freud, you have category creep in a way, and thick description. And I think the thick description part of it is interesting. And I have Freudian theorists on my show all the time. I mean, I talked to Todd McGowan. I have Daniel Tutt on regularly. But one of the things I find fascinating is like these categories are never adjusted to to social praxis, and you can draw absolutely contradictory conclusions with the same categories. And I noticed this years ago. In fact, you unfortunately had the misfortune of taking it upon yourself to transcriptize the original We're on a Pop the Left, the infamous show from 2012 to 2015, not the new one.
Yeah.
And one of the things I noticed with Zizek using Lacanian and whatever the hell his Hegelian categories are, is that in the same book he would contradict himself, like directly, and you wouldn't notice it because of the category creep. And that's not even dealing with any critical practice. That's just interpretive frameworks.
Yeah.
And I find that fascinating because you start seeing that it's kind of obvious in Zizek, but you start seeing that across the board in a lot of these more subtle social categories. I kept thinking of, for example, I was actually thinking of Eric Owen Wright and Understanding Class and trying to reconcile his maintenance of certain Cohen categorization. So J. Cohen, when he talks about the problem of exploitation, he talks about it as implicit coercion as opposed to explicit coercion, which is not the way Marx would have understood it. Like I know that he claims that, but calls it no bullshit Marxism. That's not what Marx is arguing. And then Cohen and not Cohen, and then and Eric Olin Wright in Understanding Class, like realizes this is a problem, realizes you can't explain everything through exploitation when you're moving between definitions of exploitation. One definition is Weberian, one definition is Marxist. All right. And so he comes up with this third category of dominion, but then that breaks up any ability to hold the position that he holds on what's actually wrong with exploitation and capital. So his pragmatic categories actually start to contradict with each other, and they only really become apparent. And I want to talk about specifically, I think it's chapter 9 of Understanding Class, where he talks about why he doesn't believe in labor theory of value, and makes a bunch of marginalist critiques. And I find it interesting because I realize that no one's even defined which labor theory of value they're talking about and what they think it is, and in rejecting it. But that you have these kind of frameworks that you can apply and seem very cogent and useful. In fact, I thought the domination, exploitation, extraction, our oppression, was a useful category set. But then when I went and hit his definition of what he thought exploitation was, I was like, well, that doesn't make sense then, right? Like, I think this kind of meta theory is useful because it gives you a way to more rigorously do what I think is often. I think a lot of the stuff we object to, we often have like the what I like to call the layman's analytic bullshit test theory. Like, people don't like when you tell them false consciousness because their reasons seem pretty damn accurate. It's the ideological explanations that are a problem, and even that's usually created by people who are coming up with social explanations on a group scale, not on an individual. And a lot of this stuff also you can kind of sniff out a kind of basic part to whole fallacy in a whole lot of sociological thinking.
Well, I think Martin is very like it's I think again going back to like the way that Wright and Martin both are into like pragmatism. What's interesting is that Martin's whole argument is like we need to get away from the idea that the best way to explain stuff is to find a bunch of common unifying elements, make an abstraction, turn that abstraction into a category, and then say this category that is consistent across a bunch of different things contains much more explanatory power than talking about like specific stuff that people are doing. Now, he's not saying that it's not important to like talk about categories, but part of his point is that like, to put it in terms of like Marx and Engels, people make a lot of hay about like how Marx and Engels like figured out that this category proves exploitation or whatever. But most of the categories that Marx talks about in like Capital are not him like bringing in original stuff. Like even to some extent, he talks like the most original thing is maybe like the distinction between like labor and labor power. But even that, like, if I remember correctly, like the term labor power comes from like Hegel in connection to like how Hegel understands like the English political economists. And like, again, it's kind of like Marx is not necessarily trying to show that if he brings in this new category that connects a bunch of different stuff, that by connecting a bunch of different stuff, he's made like this really great explanation. He's trying to show what are the relationships that people do that like come up with this reason why people would like pragmatically in day-to-day life try to track value. And why is it that there's all this kind of like weird stuff when you look at the concreteness that comes in with that, you know, like it's why I always emphasize that like Marx did look at accounting stuff and like he compared accountancy to the political economists, because that's an area where you can see people trying to use this category of value in a pragmatic way to like keep track of things and see how it happens. So Marx isn't trying to bring in value and go, look, I have this great category that explains a bunch of stuff. He's trying to say, this is a category that has coherency, like that has coherence, that is recognized by the political economists themselves. It's coherent because political economists are trying to do something. And even in his critique of like value is that they produce bad explanations for it. That critique of the explanations also ties into a critique of, do we need value in order to produce useful like organization of human connections? But it doesn't necessarily come in by saying like, it's neither that value is this amazing thing category that Marx invented that connects a bunch of stuff arbitrarily and he's throwing it in, nor is it like him just going like, political economists are like having false repressed experience and therefore they misunderstand value. Like it's a much more, it's trying to reorientate towards like this specific kind of understanding of like concrete human connectivity, and how like Martin's argument is like, you need to recognize when actors themselves have categories and figure out why they have them in a way that isn't just dismissing it on the basis of like their experience is bad. And I think if you thought about it with like the PMC thing, the truth about like when most people talk about PMC as a category, it's like the truth of it is that I do think that if you go to a lot of people, whether they're, you know, people who earn a wage or earn a salary, or even if they're millionaires or something, I think a lot of people will go, yeah, there's something about people that have this kind of like semi-secure professionalized thing, or that work like higher income white collar jobs with like a lot of that usually have a lot of like educational certification. Like, I think most people will go like, yeah, there's something kind of like different about it, isn't there? There's like, they have attitudes, they have tastes, but you have to be careful if you're going, well, that's because the explanation is the category PMC. Because if nobody is walking around going, there's a thing called the PMC that I orientate towards, you're already doing something that's just a little bit suspicious in terms of what the category supposedly is.
Particularly when, for example, we talk about Marx's categories. I think Eric Wright is good on this. The definitions aren't the way most people experience class, but they are totally explanatory in the functions that you have in a capitalist firm, and thus a capitalist society that keeps those firms going, right? Which is why I tell people, like, Marxists have this really obnoxious habit. Well, not all Marxists, but a lot of them, and you know who I'm talking about, to go that, like, we can only talk about class in Marxist terms ever. The other ones are wrong. And I'm like, no, the other ones are actually describing something different. You're talking about a different thing. You might use the word class for both things, but unless you have a Platonic notion of definitions, which if you're a Marxist, you're really not supposed to, that doesn't make sense. Like, to just insist that, like, oh, well, the way, liberals talk about class doesn't make any sense. Badurian frameworks don't make any sense. I'm like, well, no, they make a lot of sense. They just explain something completely different. Overlapping, but social status games versus capital competition are not actually the same thing. And so, and Marx doesn't attempt to, for example, go into habitus like sociology or whatever, a la Badiou. It's just not. It's not a concern of his writing. He's not doing, the reason why the proletariat does X is because they grow up in this environment where X happens, and this, that's not what he's doing. That's not his interest. With Levi, you do get this kind of cogent. Well, look at what is actually being despoiled here, but are explained here, and what are you using with the categories? Because you know me, like I've been at this war with the idea of false consciousness for a long time, because I think it's way too easy a dismissal. And for example, even if you define it well, like it's false because it's rational in the immediate run, but it's ultimately irrational against your self-interest. And I'm like, yeah, but what time scale are you actually looking at when you say that? Like, you're not actually, this is kind of a cop-out. And it's one that I find Marx and Engels don't do that much. It's all a later imposition on the theory. I
remember looking
a little bit, but
yeah, because Martin does have a footnote where he like points out that Engels uses the term false consciousnness, but he kind of makes the argument that, like, again, it's usually used in reference to people who are trying to explain things as like political economists or people that are like trying to produce like an account of social systems. He uses like Engels uses this like thing about like, it's when they have like basically like they're motivated to try and like explain it in a way, but they can't account for their own motivation, so they just naturalize their own motivation as like a self-evident thing. I think Martin gives a good account of like, even that's problematic. He kind of talks about like talking about like motivation or something in general is problematic, but I do think he has kind of like a point there. And I do think it's funny is that like even on Wikipedia it says something about like how, like Engels used the term to refer to why the proletariat doesn't follow their own self-interest. And then you look at that letter and it's like, he's not talking about like the proletariat in general at all in this. He's talking about like the German ideologues and like political economists. Like, it has nothing to do with like proletarians thinking that they're going to get like a better deal by selling out or something like that. But I think one of the things that's very interesting about this book is it's a very interesting mix of, on the one hand, he's like, when he talks about like concrete experience and stuff, on the one hand, he's drawing very much on a lot of like, continental theory. He's drawing on like phenomenology. He's drawing on Gestalt psychology. He makes reference to the Russian activity school of psychology. And then he also brings in, American pragmatism, which is like the American branch of neo-Kantian Hegelian thought, basically. And at this end, and like he also, he hates a lot of the stuff that is associated with like analytical thought. Like, he does not like this idea that we need to like break things down into like particular elements that are all independent. He wants to maintain a holistic analysis of how people experience things. He does not like the way that people use statistics to claim causal mechanisms based on correlations. But
I don't either, but it's hard not to.
That's the thing that's interesting about him, is that on the other hand, he's really good at math. Like, you don't see it as much in this book, but he has a whole book on how to use statistics and sociology. He knows formal logic really well. He does use that quite a bit in this book. And his style of argumentation is pretty analytic, I would say, like in the sense of he tries to write very clearly and produce a very like, he's like willing to get into formal logic. He's very willing to be like, we need to look for consistency in our arguments. He's more happy to be a little bit like sarcastic than most analytical arguments are, I would say. But he's a really interesting mix in that sense, because he's kind of trying to say, like, look, we can't just like make this assumption that statistics works in this like really lovely way that we get this number and that means that there's like a cause here, or that like something is a real mechanism or whatever. Like we have to look at real experience. But he also he has a really high amount of respect for using math. He just thinks it's not that he thinks math is bad. He just thinks that most people use it in a way that's not justifiable for the claims that are put with it.
Right. Most statistical arguments are used for causal arguments as opposed to, I mean, I like econophysics for certain things, for example, but I will also admit I'm a little skeptical when you start making laws based off of statistical and probabilistic averages. Like, you know, I mean, I think there's a logical problem there. And one of the things I find refreshing about this book, I mean, it talks a lot more than about Marx, but like there's a lot of bad thinking and Marxist that this cuts against, but it does actually, I think, persuasively argue a lot of that's not in the source material. Those are habits, and they're actually habits, you know, that seem Freudian or Durkheimian, or even in some ways conservative in the way that they actually were manifested in the academy. It's kind of sneak in. I think through other habits of mind. I think the false consciousness one is one of those things that's frustrating but politically advantageous to argue, because when you are a weird sectarian party and you want to explain why no one in the working class agrees with you, appeals to false consciousness was pretty useful as a self-protection mechanism. But that's, you know, that's again social psychology, not sociology. So I think that's interesting. I think the reckoning with psychology in here, and it being both critical but not dismissive, particularly in his chapters on the history of psychology, I think that, you know, in that section called Authority and Experience, I found those to be really interesting.
I think he does a good job at like being very aware that sociologists have a bad habit of like, you know, they find one or two studies about like a psychological thing and then they go, see, this proves huge whatever thing. But he's pretty good at being like, look, on the whole, like over like the last like 50 to 100 years, a lot of the stuff that's on like based on cognitive science and experimental psychology seems to suggest that at the very least, a lot of the assumptions that we use in traditional sociological, you know, assumptions about individuals are not very rigorous and do not hold up very well. And I think like what his thing about like Durkheimianism, and I do think he has a point there,
because that's important.
I do think that with like Durkheim, though, when I read this, I was like, "Oh my god, he's right. This kind of thinking is everywhere. Like anyone who thinks that they're talking about like Marx is really like a Durkheimian. Like we thought the bad one was Weber. Weber has similar problems sometimes, but it's really Durkheim that is like insidiously everywhere. Because he goes into how Durkheim, you know, in his stuff about like totemic thinking, instigates this whole kind of approach of like, well, you know, language and understanding emerge through totemic thinking, and this is related to categorization. So when like tribal people have like, you know, clans that are based around like totemic groups, so, you know, there's like the bear tribe and the like bird tribe and the whatever tribe, like he says this is where like people categorize socially, and then they categorize the world based on the social categories that they've like developed. And this is like a very like, what I think when I say that, a lot of people are going to be like, well, yeah, that's obvious, right? Like social construction, like the idea that you socially do something and then you project it on the world. When I say this, you have to understand, like, Durkheim's point is that every categorization is socially arbitrary.
Yep.
There is nothing in the world that appears on its own as having a pattern. There is only social patternization that is projected onto things. And he talks about, like, you know, if you have like a tribe that's like supposed to be warm wind or something, and then there's like a tribe that is like the I don't know, like the buffalo tribe or something, and those are closer together than other tribes, he would say, like, the Durkheimian explanation is, it's not that like people experience some sort of closeness between warm air and buffalo. It cannot be that people realize like the buffalo are around in the summertime or something. It's that people have those tribes, and then they go, the buffalo tribe and the warm wind tribe are close together. Therefore, buffalo have an association with warm wind. It literally has to flow the other way in this explanation, because everything comes from the fact that like it presumes that the world, aside from human cognition, is total chaos. And so the only categorizing thing is a bunch of arbitrary like baskets that like you have with labels that you put things into.
Right. And I don't think Marx is that way at all. I think Marx, it took me many years to grasp this, but I think Stefan Hamill and I articulated it once. What Marx thinks ideas are is when what he means by saying you flip Hegel on his head is ideas emerge from watching the world, and whichever ones are useful for social reproduction stick. But notice the causal thing here. It is not we're arbitrarily pulling ideas out, are just making up willy-nilly, and then that's what's holding our social world together. Is Marx is saying we observe the way material things work, which things work that we can socially reproduce, or what analogies flow from that, right? Are what stick. And I think that's actually a different argument, that like that is a social construction based off of an assumption that there is some initial observation that has some tie to the world. It's a little bit more. It's more Ernest Cassirer and like than it is Durkheim. But I think most Marxist social constructivists now, because they come out of an academy that is flush with these ideas, actually do take the idea that it's basically arbitrary and that all explanations of why the category exists are post hoc. And I don't think that's true. Like I've never thought that was true. And this book was so freeing because I'm like, finally, someone just made an academic argument for something that I've like offhand observed for a long time.
And it's a really good genealogical construction of like where this comes from. Because he actually points out, like, Durkheim himself seems to kind of have realized at certain points that he was like, I have this like system of explanation, but when I actually try to apply it, it kind of like gets problematic. And he points out that it's like people like Mead, like Mary Mead and stuff, who like try to like, well, he points out that often the thing about Durkheim is Durkheim says this is how it works in like quote unquote primitive societies, and then you get like civilization or whatever, and it like becomes different. And so like a lot of people, well-meaning, were like, Durkheim like doesn't realize that he's just being like a colonial like imperialist, which he was. But their solution is, he doesn't get that this is actually true in every society, and it is the case that it's just chaos all the way down. And so even in civilized society, everything is just completely arbitrary, rather than going the other direction and going, actually, like maybe there's systemicness to things that we experience beyond just social order that has like a part in the way that we cognize practically. Like, and especially, you know, now we know that a lot of times the assumptions that he had about like how tribal systems are ordered, or like how tribal like or you know, like the societies that he was anthropologically studying, you see that a lot of times the categorizations that we think like as Westerners are often like, oh, look at how quaint and bizarre they are, they have no notion of like the reality of nature. It's actually usually that it's just a categorization that applies to a really specific task that we didn't ask about, and that's why it seems weird. There's a really brilliant part in this book where he goes through like he tries to refute kind of like the three examples people always give about like total arbitrariness. And like one is he says, people always talk about like, but in non-Western societies, there's like total arbitrary structures of gender. And he kind of goes like, well, we do know that like a lot of the features that are used to inscribe what a gender is can be very arbitrary, like the idea of whether it's masculine to be stoic or whether it's masculine to cry.
Sex characteristics or whatever.
Yeah, like that stuff is like
actually
can be very varied.
Characteristics.
But he on the same time, he's like, the thing is, we don't really know of many cultures that don't have a binary categorization. And then when there are things that are not within the main binary, they exist to point out that there's a way of like mediating between the two. There's not usually like some third or fourth category that is just completely outside the binary that is like the assumed standard. And the point isn't like some sort of like transphobic one. His point is more like, it's not wrong to see that there tend to in humans be like bifurcations of characteristics because XY chromosomes, and then sometimes when you have more or less of like certain groups of chromosomes like produce like a kind of thing that we perceive in a certain way. And it can be really powerful and liberating that societies are willing and able to notice that there are certain things that blend or allow transition between them. But it doesn't mean that we can just ignore that there are like tendencies and patterns and the kinds of characteristics that people develop that have to do with sexual reproduction, has to do with like what we now would call like, like genetical, like chromosome related things. The other example he gives is like, the whole like Inuits have a bunch of arbitrary words for snow, is like the other one. And his point is like, well, we have a lot of words for snow too. Guess what? It's about different kinds of snow because you have different problems if you're going through slush or if you're going through sleet, if you're going through powder, if you're going through like, deep snow or wet snow and stuff. But also just in general, linguistically, this argument usually isn't true. It's like they don't have like... they don't have the setup that people assume.
One of the things that I found very frustrating when we talk about, like, for example, the anthropological studies of gender. On one hand, you have people who are sex binarists who want to, point out that every society has them, blah, blah, blah. And they'll ignore stuff where, like, stuff that even doesn't immediately seem like it's a gender code. Like I talk about monks and nuns downplay secondary sex characteristics. They renounce social and tertiary sex characteristics totally. There's lots of societies that have people who assume alternate gender roles. No one has a problem with it. Gender roles in hunter-gatherer societies are rarely ever even enforced. But the funny thing is, they do exist. And even in highly egalitarian societies, the difference between an egalitarian and a non-egalitarian hunter-gatherer society. Well, there's a bunch of differences, but on gender, it's going to be, are the gender roles that are observed enforced or not? Right. And so I find it interesting that people, I call this the Steven Pinker, Michel Foucault binary, where on one hand you have people who really want to argue that like our social epistemic system is totally fucking arbitrary and this goes back to Durkheim, but I think Foucault like totally encapsulates it. Like we can't even talk about the transitions between one episteme and another episteme because while we can talk about the archaeology or genealogy, the transition is not something we can ever deal with. And the reason why we can't is because our concepts are arbitrary but totally inform our worldview, and so we can't mediate between them. That's that's normally gets framed in the somewhat unfortunately misunderstood Chomsky versus Foucault debate. But I think it's actually more interesting to think of it in this idea of this is really more of a Durkheim versus social, like realist social construction versus arbitrary social construction.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe this is a better way to think about this problem, because and I think this, to bring it to Marx, this is like one of these things where I talk about, like, Marx does talk about species being, that's a big fancy Hegelian way of saying human nature. He just talks about it being mediated by social forms in relationships in a way in which you can never observe it directly, and maybe it's not possible to want to, like, or what's possible to want to, but maybe it's not wise to want to, because you'll never actually see the unmediated, unalienated human subject. That's not, we always exist in a state of relation. We're a social animal. And I find that to be more interesting than like the Steven Pinker straw man, which is like most people believe on the left or whatever, that people are utterly conceptually and personality blank slates, and that we have an arbitrary social system that sources for us, and once we conceive it, it's stuck with us, and it's almost entirely arbitrary. And I find that to be, I mean, I find it to be, actually, it makes a lot of the claims of Marxism make no sense when you really think about it. Like, if you talk about, like, for example, the reason why exploitation would necessarily be alienating, and thus morally problematic, is actually kind of dependent on human beings actually finding being exploitative and that fundamental unfairness as a baseline universal uncool thing. Like, so class is not something any human being is going to, according to Marx, readily just accept without an elaborate system of social reproduction and material needs seemingly tied to it, right? Like, and I think, to tie this into like Levi a little bit, that would mean that, like, I don't know, I'm just seeing this everywhere once we talk about it. Like, I get really frustrated with Groove or Dave Wynn or whatever, Wingrow and Graeber, when they talk about these categories as like problems of conceptual frameworks, and if we just think things will be differently, they'll be different. Where if you actually look at, say, what the anthropology indicates, and the problem with anthropology, social psychology, and sociology is they all make competing but slightly different claims. But that what the anthropology indicates, according to what someone like Daniel B over at What Is Politics would say, or a bunch of anthropologists, is there actually are material constraints that make certain kinds of relations more likely than others. What is unique to humans or maybe unique to primates and other large brain mammals, is we do have a way to reconstruct our environment in a way to actually make certain outcomes that we want more likely. We can conceive that. That's actually a Marxist point, right? But you actually do have to change things so that the ideas that seem more emergent and socially explainable would be so. Like, it's not just a matter of, oh, if we change our frameworks for, like, we are going to pick, well, we think, we think hierarchy is bad because I don't even know how you argue that this, if you really take this social arbitrariness seriously, but we think hierarchy is bad because, I don't know, we think hierarchy is bad. So if we all just believed in egalitarian structures and created a structure on which to project that, then we could build the situation. And I think the Marxist point is, no, that's actually a feedback loop. And I found this book actually weirdly confirming of that kind of idea, that, like, most people's immediate explanations are actually probably good enough. It's the ideological or like Gestalt glosses that we give it where people should start really being suspect. And ironically, most sociology which thinks that it is critical of this would actually be also engaging in this with this like Durkheimian arbitrariness.
And I think one of the things that's like really hard to get into, like how he makes like I wrote like 2 little notebooks of notes on this book, and already like for being, like
Not
not
a very long
even
book
like
either.
it's only like 300 pages. It's like incredibly dense in like how tightly constructed his like argument is and how he's like building from like one point to another. So it's like really hard. Like if you're listening to this, you're probably like, this all sounds cool, but it's hard to get like where it's all coming together. It's really hard. Like I would have to do like an actual like chapter by chapter discussion of this book, I think. So like if you weren't going to read it, but
I'm with you
like
on that because I'm having trouble talking about this book because it's so
yeah,
fucking rich. Like,
um because I think one of the things that's hard to get at is that, like, on the one hand, he's trying to point out, like, we can't just take categories as self-evident, like, true on their own things, and we shouldn't be trying to, like, yeah, like, conglomerate things just into, like, these big subsumptive categories and then treat that as, like, a good explanation. On the other hand, though, he does want a holistic analysis. So he doesn't want to just have an analysis that breaks things down into like independent, dependent variables, and then you go, this one causes this thing, and that's really what's going on. Which is why he likes Gestalt psychology, because the reason he points to Gestalt psychology is he's trying to say, look, we can pay attention to the fact that there are social objects that produce categorizations. But that's this point, is like, rather than thinking that there's chaos and then we need to step in and like figure out a bunch of arbitrary ways of sorting it, we need to pay more attention to the fact that relationships in the world, in the social and natural world, to what extent there's a distinction, like relationships and patterns are already happening, and that's usually where we pragmatically figure out our categories, which can be really good for engaging with those things. The process of producing explanation sometimes is not going to be adequate with those kinds of categories. Um, and so he there's a point where he kind of, and another point that he says is that this means that we need to accept the idea that sometimes there are like values are not necessarily a completely subjectivist thing. Like this is where he kind of is drawing on phenomenology, like that sort of like, in a way, a hammer does tell you what to do with it. It does have like a real existence that is adequate for certain things. And when you encounter a hammer, it is going to be an object that appears in certain ways, like certain areas where it will have relationships that you as a person will likely get a sense of what you can do with it. I mean, even like other other primate groups, if you give them a hammer, they usually figure out to do something very similar to hammering with it, because
without us
like
even teaching them. So
yeah, and so he's kind of trying to say, like, when we think of categorization, what we need to start with is the idea that there's maybe a pattern going on in the world, um, and it's not wrong to say that pattern is seen as a social object, a gestalt. The power of the gestalt is precisely that things can be holistic and have properties that are not just like a bunch of things come together and then there's another thing on top of them. It's actually all the properties at once, like in the thing, that is the gestalt effect. It is a real property of how, like, in an actual gestalt effect, like in the sense of like an optical illusion, quote unquote, like the point of like the optical illusion is that there actually are real properties in the way that like geometric and topographical things like operate, and our eyes and brain will see those patterns even when it's not in the like formal self-evident form. So that's kind of what he's trying to do, and he's saying that that's true with social objects and social relations as well. And he kind of says, like, the problem is, someone might say, but does this just mean that someone who's racist is correct? Like, is it correct to just say, like, well, the guy who's racist is seeing a real value and he's being racist? And this is where the kind of distinction between experience and explanation comes in, because what John Levy Martin wants to say is, like, most of the time, if a person's racist, it's because they see there are real patterns in relationships of competition and like discomfort and disdain and like difference between people. And so we don't need to say that the explanation that this person's black, therefore I should treat them this way because being black necessitates this relationship to them as a quality of its own. But we can still say, like, the racist guy doesn't need to have repression involved. And the racist guy doesn't need to, like, we don't have to say, like, the racist guy has some sort of, like, unreal experience of the world. We just have to say, like, they experience real qualities of those relationships in a way that are not satisfactory towards, like, pointing at, like, what the actual relationships involved are. And this is part of why someone who's racist in, like, a specific way can be very puzzlingly, like, apparently not racist when they're in another thing where a new part of the relationship opens up, where, like, you know, someone who
is the infamous, and says several things
no,
about say, X group in abstract or in general, but you don't see them actively mistreat individuals or even necessarily engage in microaggressions. Like it's an interesting distinction, and I find this actually quite useful. I mean, one thing that an unfortunate truth that I have found when talking about race and sociology is a lot of the sociological research, and again, I'm not going to attribute cause here, but finds there's a strong correlative increase in bigotry when social competition for scarce resources is involved, right?
Yeah.
Again, not impugning cause, but the correlation is found over and over and over again. People seem to get more racist on a bigot level when you're dealing in a scarcer competition of resources.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, that actually, however, seems to be mitigated against by class too, meaning that the higher up in class you are, the more important a racial category becomes because there's less other mitigating factors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? We can get these are statistical findings in American and Canadian culture that are pretty consistent. It's hard not to see them, not to state them in an explanatory way. I'm actually really thinking about it because, like, I have said this and like used these as explanations before, and after reading this book, I'm like, yeah, I got to be careful about that.
Yeah, well, and it's worth pointing out that like John Levy Martin is not claiming, you know, like that actually the universe works in this way where there is no like cause effect, you know, where stuff just happens. His point is like his point is that people will prioritize this idea of third person causes, this idea that there's always something external to people that is like enforcing their behavior, either through like mechanistically that like something is hitting you and causing you to do something, or in this like kind of like idea of like like constraints, like behavior is constrained because of these external causes. And he's just trying to say we need to think about motivational cause in the sense of like actually taking realistically what the people themselves are like orienting themselves towards as actors and what their perceptual schema is that allows them to orient themselves. So like he like in that way, like he's not saying like that people are just doing something as this totally like almost like Deleuzian, you know, organ without body without organs type like anomaly thing. He's just saying like when we have this idea that like there's always an external third person cause always trumps any sort of sense of like the cognition of the actor, then it's a problem. Because like with the type of stuff you're saying, like I think that I mean he's a sociologist who does a lot of stuff on class, and he always like is talking about stuff that it's like, yeah, we can totally find that like class is a really big distinguishing factor in sort of divisions. He would just say like we need to treat most of these statistics even when they're strong like causal correlations. Like he basically is like a lot of statistic causality is still descriptive. Like that's kind of his thing. Like it doesn't actually tell you what the interaction is that like is going on at that level. So I think he would totally say, like, yeah, it potentially makes a lot of sense that stuff's going on. You just need to try and do the work to think about like why actors would be behaving in a certain way beyond just saying, you know,
They do.
they do. Like, yeah,
Right.
exactly. Like, because he tends to say, like, he says, like, a lot of these kind of like quote unquote functional explanations are super tautological. That it is just like the thing does the thing because it's the thing and it's doing it.
Right. Well,
Like,
that's one thing that I've been maddened by when we talk about sociology, like with racism or patriarchy or whatever, is I think these are real useful constructs for talking about certain systems. But the way leftists often deploy them, they both are guilty of that Durkheimian arbitrariness, but they're also circular, and they're perfectly circular. X is patriarchal because patriarchal is when X happens. And it's just like, well, that's not actually even, that's not wrong. That's not communicative, actually. I like this is where my whole like Wittgensteinian language game thing, like that's a language game that literally if I haven't accepted the category, it is totally explanatory.
yeah,
And
it's a
it's
black
actually
box.
right. It's a black
Like,
box which people can project, which is politically or socially quite useful for social manipulation, not in a false consciousness way, but because people can actually, I think this actually explains why a lot of individuals might feel like, well, X is bad or X is good, because I defined X this way from my experience, this how, and I'm projecting it on this abstraction, right? And
and
I like to think of that as non-communicative communication, and a lot of
yeah,
leftist theory actually becomes that.
well, because I think it's the kind of thing that like when he talks about like functions and functional explanations, a lot of what he points out is that um they might not necessarily, like in the case of like patriarchy or something, it's not necessarily wrong to like point to a group of relationships in particular, like uh partnered husband wife man woman type
Yeah.
relationships, and say like there's something going on here that is like clearly an imbalance of power. His point is that if you're going to say it is like a function of patriarchy to have this happen, really what you're saying is that the group of people that we have are able to orient themselves to realize like the pattern of what's going on in the world is beneficial for one group and not for the other in a particular way. Or I mean benefit and loss is like a somewhat like problematic type thing, because like you can get into relationships where like in like, a woman does see certain sorts of benefits even from a like problematic patriarchal relationship. But the point is like usually when people are talking about functions, they're just talking about how there's one group of people that are also a motivated actor that want certain things to happen. But instead of talking about those people like that as a group of people with motivated reasons, they impute it to this idea that there's just like a general category that is functional.
Right.
And that's what his point of like the problem, that's what he's saying is the problem, is like if you just go it's functional for education to do this because we need it, like it's usually ironically, even though most people are claiming, like in Marxist spheres, most people do this to make like a critical claim of like, aha, look how bad and authoritarian it is that these functional systems happen. But what he's saying is like, what's actually kind of funny is these kind of explanations totally erase any need to talk about people with power, because you just assume the people with power are the function. So you actually don't need to like actually examine like why there's a bunch of people with motivated be oriented like behavior to maintain a certain system, because you adopt their viewpoint of it that it's a self-evident function.
Right. It's bourgeoisie does X because they are bourgeoisie.
Yeah.
And that seems self-evident. And I've always kind of taken this as again as a part the whole fallacy, where like, or hold the part fallacy in that case, where like we can talk about the bourgeoisie X in aggregate pretty consistently as things that will happen in this system that are incentivized by the logic of the system in aggregate. I don't think it's useful for individual action hardly at all. And I know that creates an unfortunate gap for people like that, because like people go, well, then how does it happen? And I'm like, well, it's kind of a probabilistic likelihood, given a bunch of incentives and relationships that we see. But there are going to be occasional people who buck it, right? Like, and I think this is actually quite useful for talking about that, but also just talking in general. Like, take people's self-explanations when they're not trying to do a theoretical explanation of a category or a system, you know, as at face value, until they start dipping into things that are coming from categorical explanations. And, you know, like, we do this because capitalists do this, and this is how you get ahead, blah, blah, blah. Like, that's going to be problematic. But like, I did this for this reason, this is my incentive for doing it, is actually often on an individual level, like, not totally wrong. And to bracket that out, I think both brackets out explanations. It also makes it very hard to politically like appeal to people, because you're always like there's a problem with what I was talking about, the political usefulness of like these abstractions, because eventually people realize that you don't mean the same thing by them that they do. And it can cause all kinds of problems when that happens, which is why like populist rhetoric and whatnot tends to have a pretty limited shelf life.
I think with this kind of thing, one of the most interesting parts of this book, and he goes more into this in his book on methods, because he has sections on like doing qualitative methods. But I think he points out that one of the interesting things that goes on here, and he relates this to a whole bunch of philosophical stuff and like Kant and stuff, is this prioritization of like, you have to go up to people and you have to ask them, why did you do this? And like, that's the starting point. And he kind of says like, this is a really problematic starting point, actually, because asking someone why is actually asking them to justify themselves, to say, you must be a rational actor, prove it. Why did you do this thing? And that, you know, like that is probably not going to get you like that you, the explanations that people provide are probably based on real experiences, real feelings. It's probably not necessarily going to be the best or most robust explanation. But the problem is like, his point is like, we're asking people questions whose entire point is then to dismiss them because the questions themselves are stupid. Like, because most people have rational, like, phenomenological reasons to do the stuff that they're doing, and they understand that there are real patterns in the world that they're acting upon. But like, our brains are really suited for focusing on the thing we're trying to do, not for reconstructing the entire like process by which we came to do it. And so he talks a lot about like, we need to think of asking people like really clear tasks that are much more oriented towards like, we already know that the person did the thing. We usually want to ask, we want to confirm that they did the thing. We want to confirm how they, like, what they thought they were doing in a way that isn't asking them to just justify it. We want to ask them and see how they're doing it. That's usually where most of the meaty, interesting stuff is going on. Because like, in a way, like when we say, you know, on the left, like, you know, the capitalists did this awful thing because they're a capitalist. Like, oftentimes, like there is like a kind of truth, like there's a certain self-evidency to it. But like, the self-evidency is only if you take seriously that like the person who's being a capitalist, they're orienting their world around specific categories that aren't just things in their head, but are real relationships that go on to them being who they are and doing certain things. And a lot of times that has to do with categories of like maintaining value and stuff. So it is kind of like, yeah, like, but like, you don't have to think of it as like value is this parasite in their mind. You have to think like, you know, it's kind of thing. It's like, we talk a lot about this whole like capital isn't a thing, it's a relationship. But it's like being a proletariat, like being a proletarian in some sense is a relationship. Being lumpenized is a relationship. Like being a bourgeois, like someone in the bourgeoisie is a relationship. Like Like, in a way, you don't need to talk about the proletariat, the bourgeoisie, the lumpen. Like, you need to talk about people being bourgeoisified, people being lumpenized, people being proletarianized. Like, that's kind of what we're getting at.
Which is interesting, actually, what I was thinking about this when people ask me, why are so many Marxists not proles? And I'm like, well, I don't know why you ever think they would have been. Marx doesn't even think that. He talks about proletarianization, and proletarianization actually has two different definitions in Marx. He doesn't define them, but we can define them by their use. And proletarianization and capital is the act of people being forced into the proletarian labor market. But proletarianization in the manifesto is seeing your lot with the function of the proletariat, like, oh, I might be one of them, or I don't want this to exist, or whatever. And then you, as an individual, can choose to be proletarianized and side with the proletariat. And bourgeoisification and bourgeoisification works the same way. All right. And that makes a lot of sense. Like when like you hear Engels complaining about, like, well, the English working class thinks of themselves as like mini bourgeois or aristocrats or whatever. Like, that makes more sense if you think about the implication part of it, as opposed to a staid sociological category. And this also does away with this false binary you often get around Marxists, where it's either, well, by proletariat, we don't mean just a sociological category, we mean the political consciousness a la Hegel. Therefore, the proletariat is only the proletariat when it does what we think it should already do, which is an even more circular. I mean, like, that's double circular. It's both circular and
that's what I was talking with Amo about with Lukács. Is like, you get this thing of like Lukács seems really elegant if you're someone who is in a revolution or is sitting there going, wow, I wish that there was someone telling me what it was like to be in a revolution. But when you're not in a revolution, it seems entirely self-encapsulated and circular, because revolution is a thing that transforms society into a rational form that is distinct from like bourgeois rationality. It's rational because it's the expressed need of the proletariat as subject and object of society. And the proletariat is like doing this because they're the rational actor. Like it just like totally keeps going back to like this circular thing. Like, and it becomes really hard to justify. Like, it makes sense if it's, in a way, it like Martin would say, it makes sense if you think Lukács is a guy seeing real patterns in the Hungarian Revolution, and he's trying to write about it. And he's not necessarily wrong to write about it, and there's some truth about what might have been going on.
But then he makes it an epistemic and methodological claim.
Yeah, but if you actually try to use it as like as an explanation or a claim, and like to be fair, Lukács just goes, hey, I'm not making a sociological argument. This doesn't have any, like, you can't categorize it this way. But it just kind of becomes useless to most other people in that situation. And I think Martin here, like, his attempt to kind of talk about this, because he doesn't want, he also doesn't like kind of what he calls wishy-washy, like, arguments that just go, it's both, like, it's agency and structure, it's this thing and this thing.
The whole most common argument, though, in academia now, where you either use 50 qualifiers, or you claim that something is both two categories at once, and even if those categories contradict each other, and you don't deal with that,
because he kind of he says that, like, a lot of times the arguments fall apart because they're just contradictory, or it's or you get again into something that's you're just breaking down. Like, he gives the example of what's his name, the analytical Marxist who talks about social democracy, and Przeworski or
Przeworski. I think the P and S kind of gets blended into an S, but I've never said it right in my life. So.
But he gives the example of one of his works where he's like, is trying to be like, why does this guy vote communist? And they like break him down into different, attributes, and then they do statistical analysis, and they try to come up with a thing that's like, once you have this number of attributes that it reaches 1, then he votes communist. And Martin is kind of like, yeah, that kind of seems robust, but really most of the time what this actually is saying in practice is this guy voted communist because he's this guy.
Right.
And he wanted to vote communist. Like,
right.
And most of the attributes that you're attributing to him actually should theoretically like imply something about the way that he views himself in the world. And that's actually where the most interesting like explanatory stuff is like, why does this guy think that he is this way? What are the patterns that he sees in the world that he relates to and orients himself around? Not just in like just like this like list of attributes with like certain percentages of like the likelihood that they contribute to something. Like that can be descriptively useful for like on the whole, like, yeah, more people are communists that have these things. But when you're asking, why did this guy do it? It doesn't actually explain it. It just gives you the guy did it because he's this guy. And so Martin tries to argue for a robust form of field theory, which is again where he draws most heavily from Bourdieu. And he actually did a good job of like, even on the previous discussion we had back when you were still doing Zero Books, we had the discussion that I appeared and I talked about why I thought Bourdieu was important. And this book actually helped me realize that I made some cases in that discussion that I think are not helpful or that are misleading. Particularly like he talks about like, you know, he connects like habitus, you know, he makes the point like this applies to habitus too. Using habitus as an explanation on its own is not helpful. That's not why that category is there. Because if you're saying this person acted like a worker because they have a worker's habitus, you again just get this
again circular.
Like, yeah, or else it's just habitus is a black box of just like the person has a bunch of stuff that makes them do the thing. We can't say what it is. But he kind of makes the case like habitus is useful if the point is to orientate towards why do people have habits in their practical social life? And what's more, why does it seem like habits are kind of scaled in a certain way? Like people have multiple habits and they seem to scale their habits to certain situations that they come to understand. And in a way that kind of is what their like class orientation is. It's like the sense of being able to enter a new zone and have a different, you know, hexis of habits going on. And
which
so
is
it's
why
more
you can't universalize, like you can't universalize a working class habitus. Like,
yeah,
like for example, like what it means to be working class in like southern France versus like China, it will be a different thing as far as habitus and stuff goes.
mm-hmm.
I mean, the level of abstraction I think matters, and you know, and I think that's hard for people to totally grok, but you know, for example, one of the reasons why the bourgeoisie proletariat conflict works and seems to be pretty consistently true is it is at a level of capital that is foundational, right? Whereas other like attempts to describe, say, strata or social categories like lumpen or strata like petite bourgeois, labor aristocrat are going to move around an insane amount because they are about specific relationships in specific places at specific times. And they're going to look differently, which is why certain attempts to be like, oh, this will always be, I don't know, fascism is used a commonly argued one, I think is highly misleading, even if we can say, for example, coalitions of different classes and intermediate tiers that are highly precarious may favor factors of an authoritarian state, such as fascism, like, or Bonapartism or whatever, right? That, and it's interesting because a lot of the observations remain somewhat the same, but we're much more humble in what we're and how we're explaining them, I think, when we do that. And this book is helpful for that. It's also helpful, though, not to then try to do the whole completely methodologically individualist stuff that like Sproswowski or John Romer and the analytical Marxists tried to do in the 1980s and 90s, which totally didn't work. I mean, Tom Mayer's book, which Esri XB put me onto way back in the day on analytical Marxism. All it does is state the criterions as defined by analytical Marxism and see if they can cohere to them, and most of them they can't.
Yeah.
Right. Not without redefinitions would make a lot of the criterion circular. Although with cases like rational choice models, like they're already circular. So
yeah.
I mean, here you go. So we've been talking for an hour and a half on a book that I'm guessing most of my audience hasn't read, because until you started writing about it, I hadn't heard about it. And Marxist writing clearly about theory that take both continental and analytical philosophy serious. I don't know if this guy's a Marxist, but at least takes Marxism seriously. Takes analytical and continental theory and sociology and anthropology seriously is pretty rare, even in academia. And when you started suggesting this book to me, I started looking at other books like Thinking Through Theory and Social Structures, which I think also
that's his first book, and they're kind of complementary.
I haven't read the methodological books or any of those yet, I haven't read the two books I mentioned. I just skimmed them, but I'm like, oh, this guy seems interesting.
I think he is one of the most interesting, just kind of like, because there's an interview where he says that he sort of started out as like this kind of like more Marxist industrial work type class sociology, and now he's kind of spread out into this more like a much wider range of stuff that's kind of like, some of it's cultural sociology, some of it's more just like methodological theory, that kind of stuff. I think this book, like when it comes to like discussing politics and stuff, I think it is kind of where he rarely does it. It is clear that he is more liberal, especially drawing from the pragmatic kind of approach of Dewey, that he sometimes does have this approach that it's like, and we just need more democracy, like kind of thing. But I think that in a way, you asked like, why should communists or whatever, or leftists or whoever we want to say, why should they read this book? In a way, I think it does get you into a really thinking about like, there actually is kind of like a real problematic about like producing robust explanations of things, and also motivating people and coming up with explanations that are supposed to get people to act in new ways. And this book is coming from the perspective of like why you need like really good robust analysis as a sociologist, as an for explanation that isn't necessarily about like intervening as like a someone who's interested in like political power or something. And I don't know, like I don't have a good explanation, I guess, of like how to fully integrate what he's bringing up here. But I do think that it produces it suggests a more useful way of like what you should assume when you're dealing with other people, and trying to think about how they're working in the world or working with the world,
and taking what they say seriously without just setting them up to be like, aha, we know the secret, and it's X criterion of which you have fooled yourselves. I always called this Marxio-Gnosticism. So
right, exactly. Like you don't like it's a way he's trying to produce certain way, and he goes into a bunch of other stuff, like, and like his whole thing about like field theory and stuff. He gives you a lot more technical kind of stuff about kind of what he's trying to build up in terms of like actual like sociological explanation. His book on methods does this. His book on statistics helps with this. But I think it does give you a good kind of sense of like, okay, how should I like really try and engage with people in a way that I'm trying to start with the world? Like, you know, it's kind of, it's a good compliment to like, I think getting at the sort of Marx and Engels, like, what is materialism? What does it mean to not be a German idealist? How do you assume that people start with real relationships with the world? And that should be your starting point. And how do you try to find robust ways of talking with people and thinking about this that neither involves dismissing their experience as somehow not grasping the truth, but also not necessarily believing that all of their explanations for social processes are going to automatically make sense just based on their phenomenological experiences. Because most of us who engage with, sociological research, put broadly, whether that's like workers' inquiry or trying to organize or whatever, a lot of us probably have a sense of like, yeah, there's sometimes points where you realize your own explanation for something doesn't necessarily hold up. But producing an explanation that cannot connect to any social actors, categories, or self-conception is usually a warning sign that you're just imparting something that has no grounding in the relationships that are going on.
Okay.
So I think that's why this is a good book. It's a good for opening up how complex that kind of issue is.
Yeah, and I would tell people to read it. I think even though we've made it sound dense, and it is not dense in the way a Baudrillard, I'm picking on Baudrillard today, but a Baudrillard text is dense.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, he's
90s analytic philosophy. It's just there's a lot of social categories and construction and history packed into very short periods of time. When you're talking about a book that's 300 pages, that means he's going over like most of the history of psychology and sociology and analyzing it pretty quickly.
And like I mean, it definitely helps that he is very well known, especially his Thinking Through series. He is well known for being also a very funny writer. This book is a little bit more academic, but he has some really good zingers in it, and that's always nice to like to read through. When he does a good job at that, like here's like the really rigorous argument. Now I'm going to call someone stupid for a paragraph, and then I'm going to go back to a really rigorous argument.
I was
makes
actually
it
thinking
a little
about
easier
that
to read.
Because like moderate-ish liberal philosophers that I enjoy reading, like Bernard Williams and Raymond Tallis, do that, but they don't have our politics or our social inclinations. So it's nice reading someone who writes clearly, with closer to our politics and social inclinations, who's also like straightforwardly funny at points, and just when he hits you, like, man, like when he hits an argument and eviscerates it, it's eviscerated. Like it's taken apart pretty good.
And I think one of the most damning things that he brings up is like some people might be like, well, why is he producing this argument that calls people stupid if his whole argument is to take seriously what other people do? And one of his main things is he's saying the reason that sociologists like to assume that everyone's categories are arbitrary is because then we can assume that they do what we do. And what we do is we like to know that things can be potentially arbitrary because we are pragmatically oriented towards writing a lot of books that make arguments that we don't like to explain. So it really helps if you assume that everyone else is doing that with their categories. And again, I think he's always orienting it towards, you can say that someone's explanation is stupid. You just shouldn't say that they are like necessarily
fooled or whatever.
Yeah, like fooled. Because you can, it's okay to point out that sociologists are people that are trying to produce really big arguments about behavior. And oftentimes you can notice if someone is producing motivated behavior when the thing they are trying to do is explain something. But it's difficult when you're saying that someone is like repressing their thoughts or something. Like you don't need to, most people, it wouldn't make sense to go like, or I mean, some Marxists will say like this bourgeois sociologist is repressing their bourgeois understanding.
It's more of a psychological, psychoanalytic thing to accuse people of repression in a way that that is a totally unsound argument, because by denying it, you are actually it's basic. Repression is a category that begs the question, to put it clearly. Like, and so
if you assume that there is like a psychological mechanism called repression that relates to mediating stuff from consciousness to unconsciousness in this like model where both spheres compete on linguistic terms, like if by repression you mean this person feels uncomfortable doubling down on something and therefore is going to switch and justify it in a different way, yeah, people do that, but it's not explained by appealing to a mechanism called repression within like this unreachable black box of the brain. You can just say a person feels uncomfortable and realizes that this may not make them look good, so they're going to try and talk about things in a way that orientates like or like positions themselves in like recognition of other people, or aims to receive recognition that they think will like be good, or that doesn't go to uncomfortable like answers. But those are all different things than saying this person's repressed.
Right. And lastly, what I like about this book is it doesn't exempt your own field or yourself from these tendencies, which is the most damning thing people do. That's not just a left theory or Marxist theory or socialist theory thing. That's like universal, but where like your categories have a state of exemption where everyone's logic is motivated but yours, which is ridiculous as an assumption. Thank you so much for coming on. I think now that you're back in the States, you might be a more regular fixture again.
I'm always happy to come on.
Yep, I'm always happy to have you on, particularly since you're always reading something that even usually I haven't read. So,
next up, we can read an actually thousands of page long book and talk about The Man Without Qualities by Robert Musil, the unfinished great Viennese novel by a guy that wanted to write about philosophy in literary terms, but actually did a good job of it for once.
I hope he did a good job with that page count.
Yeah,
because that's up there with. I mean, I feel like that's gonna. You can throw that at Infinite Jest and it's gonna win. Yeah. But anyway, thank you so much, Patrick. PH. See you later.
See you.